say I was hoping to catch the ferry, but I think that's out of the question now, even though that one's still running. I listened very closely to what the member had to say from Peace River South, and I certainly admire the passion with which he spoke about farmers and about farming. I want to begin by saying that on this side of the House, we are equally passionate about farmers and farming, and perhaps it would have been a grand idea in the course of the last election in this province for us to have a fulsome debate about what it means to support farmers and to support farming, and a discussion about the agricultural land reserve. I didn't hear it from the candidate in my constituency. I've talked to people who ran for office and who were elected to office right across British Columbia. Changes to the agricultural land reserve were not part of the BC Liberal Party's platform. Not once, not anywhere. And when rumors bubbled up from time to time, the Liberal Party was very firm about stamping them out and saying, no, we're not talking about changes to the Agricultural Land Commission or the Agricultural Land Reserve. Now, I understand that when governments are elected because they get a majority of seats, that there are changes they decide to make. But surely, this is a policy, this is an institution that has been created and built over 40 years through successive governments of various ideological stripes. And surely, if the BC Liberal Party wanted to make sweeping changes to the Agricultural Land Reserve and the Agricultural Land Commission, the voters of British Columbia were entitled to hear about that and to know about that so that they could make an informed decision. But in fact, that election was just a year ago, and there was not a peep from people in this government who now are instituting sweeping changes about it. There have been rumors last fall, in particular because of what was perceived as interference by some ministers, past and present, of this government. But it wasn't until November of 2013 that some of this stuff started really coming out into the open. And when BC Liberal plans to make major changes to the Agricultural Land Commission were brought to light, when various government documents were leaked to the media. And it wasn't until a bit later that we actually saw and were able to read a leaked cabinet document, cabinet decision summary sheet, that said, quote, "The Agricultural Land Commission legislative mandate is too narrow to allow decisions that align with the priority for economic development." And it gave a step-by-step description of what actions the Minister of Agriculture would take, calling on Cabinet to allow the development of policy, regulatory, and legislative amendments to make the changes. Well, when that did come to light, the Minister of Energy and Mines, who had earlier in 2013 promised that the BC Liberals' core review would look at some sacrosanct things like the Agricultural Land Reserve and the ALC, said, and I quote, "It's a cabinet process. You apparently have a cabinet document. I'm not permitted to talk about the cabinet processes and the things that are being discussed." Of course, in early November, that same minister for the core review insisted that BC was not considering dismantling the Agricultural Land Commission or bringing it within government as part of the review. Nothing that the core review process could potentially do would reduce the protection for farmland in British Columbia. Quote, "Bottom line, there's nothing that we would contemplate that would reduce or undermine the central principle of the ALR, which is the protection of farmland and the sustainability of growing." Well, that was November of 2013. Wasn't many weeks later, many months later, that we had this bill. One that does in fact propose sweeping changes that allow valuable farmland to be taken out of the Agricultural Land reserve. And this was supposedly as a result of the core review. But when, I think we should ask, when did a change to the mandate of the Agricultural Land Commission and the Agricultural Land Reserve become part of the mandate of the core review? How did that happen? Was anyone in the agricultural sector consulted about this becoming part of the core review? Was the Agricultural Land Commission consulted? No. Were communities in regions across British Columbia consulted about this coming under the core review? The answer to all of the above questions is obviously no. Nobody was consulted about what the government subsequently decided to do. So this government clearly has no mandate as a result either of the last election or of consultations in the period since the last election from the agricultural community or from communities across this province, to proceed in this way. Now, when the new Minister of Agriculture was appointed a number of weeks ago, he actually inspired some considerable interest and I would say support, because he said right from the outset, and I will say by way of introduction that I had the pleasure of working with the minister, the now Minister of Agriculture, when he was the chair of the Select Standing Committee on Health. And he certainly in this role believed, and he practiced what he preached, he believed that people should be consulted, that people should be brought together to talk about what we wanted to do, in this case, to improve our healthcare system and to ensure that it was sustainable. And he was very open to bringing together experts who would have different opinions on the issue to be consulted before bringing recommendations back to this House. So it was very encouraging when he said, not long after being appointed, that he was willing to reconsider legislation that would change the Agricultural Land Reserve, but that he wanted to hear from British Columbians right across BC before he made up his mind. It was even more encouraging after he held what I gather was a 7-hour meeting with farmers and ranchers in Abbotsford, when he said that he needed to hear, he'd heard from them, he'd heard an awful lot of strong opinions from them, opposed to what the government was doing, and that he also needed to hear from the rest of the province before deciding whether to change or withdraw from the legislature the proposed legislation concerning the Agricultural Land Reserve. The opportunity is, quote, "The opportunity is everything from amending the bill to leaving it alone to removing the bill," the Minister of Agriculture said in an interview. "I haven't landed on any particular recommendation yet because I'm not finished my consultation process." And kudos to the Minister of Agriculture for taking that approach. And he asked the ministry staff to organize a BC-wide consultation. So, okay, we might say that it should take the form of more than phone, Twitter, or web-based town hall meetings to consult. It ought to, and I believe that was the minister's intention, to actually go and talk to people right across the province. And again, kudos to him for taking that approach. The BC Agricultural Council, as we all know, represents more than 14,000 farmers and ranchers across the province, and it has stated repeatedly that this overhaul would leave northern farmland at risk of development for resource projects. The minister said that he has heard arguments from both supporters and opponents, and he says that he has personally read, Minister, Minister, I'm singing your praises. I'm singing your praises, so.
Through the chair, madam.
Through the chair to the minister. I'm singing his praises. He just might want to pay attention. The minister says that he's heard arguments from both supporters and opponents, that he's personally read every email that's been sent to his ministry on the subject, and the BC Agricultural Council chair said he was pleased to hear that the minister would in fact engage in province-wide consultation. There's definitely a path forward, said Mr. van der Wal. And after the consultation, the minister said he would then make recommendations to the BC Liberal caucus on what to do, and then talk to farmers again. As I said, people were very encouraged. Farmers were very encouraged across BC. But what happened next was very, very disturbing. Very disturbing, both, I think, to the democratic process and also very disturbing on this particular issue, because essentially, the Minister of Energy and Mines and the Minister responsible for the core review came forward and essentially pulled the plug on the Minister of Agriculture's plan to thoroughly review the issue and to conduct full consultations. And the people of British Columbia were told in no uncertain terms by the minister responsible for the core review, not the Minister of Agriculture, were told that this bill would be passed in this sitting of the House with no significant changes. An affront not just to the Minister of Agriculture, but to people from across British Columbia who have been flooding this minister, who have been flooding the Premier, who have been flooding cabinet members and all members of this House with their opinions on the Agricultural Land Reserve. Now, I can say to you that I take, as a member of the Legislative Assembly for New Westminster, I take my responsibility to listen to my constituents very seriously. And when I speak in this House, I do my very best to reflect their views and to be guided by their opinions. So on an important issue like this, I asked my constituents, as other members of the opposition have done, to share their feelings and their opinions on this issue with me so that I could in fact share them with this House. And I can tell you that they flooded me with responses. People are very concerned about a whole lot of things. They're concerned about the lack of mandate for this BC Liberal government to proceed in this way without having brought such a fundamental issue before the voters. They're very concerned and angry about the lack of consultation, but they also tell me over and over and over again how passionate they are about the food they eat and where they come from. They tell me how deeply concerned they are about food security, the security of our sources of food in the present and in the future. And they also tell me how deeply concerned they are about the economy and about the need to support farmers and farming jobs by protecting the Agricultural Land Reserve, not by reducing it. And I want to just read some of the comments that my constituents have made to me, just a sampling of them. A registered dietitian wrote, "Oh, I have plenty to say. We are so fortunate to have so much great farmland that we take it for granted. But the population is increasing and the amount of land we have to grow food on is decreasing, so it's critical that we preserve every bit that we can. Because once it's gone," she says, "it's gone forever. We can't rely on outside sources, whether it's because of droughts in California or drug cartels in Mexico. We can't depend on others to ensure that 1, there is enough food, 2, that it's not outrageously expensive, and 3, that they don't use pesticides or chemicals that we in this province and in this country have deemed as dangerous. The proposed changes to the ALR," she continues, "are about the economy, but it's misdirected. Rather than thinking of the ALR as a barrier to economic development, it should be thought of as an untapped natural resource. If we were to maximize our food economy, the full food system, not just production, but processing, value added, restaurants, agritourism, etc., it would inject billions into the economy as well as feed us." She concludes by saying, "I do nutrition tours with grade 6 and 7 classes, and I talk to them about sustainability in real, simple terms. I tell them the Agricultural Land Reserve is there to protect their food future, while defeating Bill 24 is about protecting our food future for generations to come." The next message I want to read was one that is very short and sweet. This is someone who's active in New West Environmental Partners who says, quote, "Development of farmland for other uses is unethical as we face a fragile future. Legislators and civil servants have a responsibility to reverse the loss of farmland and small farmers. Thank you for allowing us to take part in participatory democracy. And here's a letter that was copied to me, but in fact sent to the Premier. This is from the New Westminster Community Food Action Committee. We're writing on behalf of the New West Food Action Committee, whose mandate is to address food security and food sovereignty issues that impact our community. As such, we feel compelled to write to you to voice our support for protecting, if not strengthening, the mandate of the Agricultural Land Commission and the role it plays in protecting our precious farmland, ensuring the ALC is able to fulfill its mandate independently, without political interference, and realizing the enormous economic job creation and food production potential of the underutilized agricultural land reserve land. Farmland is a precious commodity, and a balance needs to be achieved between development and our ability to grow our own food, she says. Food security is a goal, while food sovereignty describes how we get there. Food sovereignty is about control of our food system. As we lose farmland to non-farming purposes, it undermines our ability to feed ourselves. Besides issues of capacity, farmland is already so scarce, and it will become worse as our population increases. Relying on food from outside of BC means we no longer have influence on issues such as pricing, or in the case of imported foods, what pesticides are used or not used. And she concludes by saying, and again, a concern about farmers, farm jobs, and farmland. The ALR is often seen as a barrier to economic development, and we wish to vehemently refute this. While non-agricultural development may be necessary, it should not come at the expense of farmland. Rather than being viewed as a barrier, unused ALR land should be recognized for its unrealized potential. And she concludes by talking about the BC Liberals' jobs plan. Quote, more and better jobs means a better future for BC's families. Job creation and economic stability require many actions. Well, she says, maximizing our agricultural potential will not only achieve food security goals, but it would contribute greatly to our economic success. And the final letter that I want to reference, and I will just reference it in part, seeing the time, this is from a geoscientist who lives in my community. I work as an environmental geoscientist, he said, and part of my role is to assist with the enforcement of environmental protection laws. My experience has been that the majority of the agricultural community, and he's worked as a geoscientist, he's in fact from Kitimat, and he's worked as a geoscientist right across the province. My experience has been that the majority of the agricultural community is very aware of the need to protect the soil and water resources that their livelihood and our water systems rely on. However, I've also seen an Agricultural Land Commission made toothless in its efforts to protect the land from those few bad actors who care not about the land, but are profiting from the development of farmland into more lucrative uses. How toothless, he asks? The front line of defense for the ALC has been compliance and enforcement officers who can visit farms where illegal fill has been placed, where non-farm use has damaged the soil, where the very systems that would support farming are destroyed by irresponsible practices. And recently, the compliance and enforcement staff of the ALC has been reduced to a single officer. I repeat, has been reduced to a single officer. One lone officer to cover the 4.7 million hectares of farmland from Saturna Island to Dawson Creek, from Creston to Chilliwack, and as a result, complaints sent to the ALR, the majority from concerned farmers themselves, go uninvestigated and illegal practices unenforced. My point is that the ALC does not need to be split up, recharacterized, or dissected. It needs to be resourced and strengthened. The true threat to this valuable and unique resource is death by a million small cuts. I could go on, but I will perhaps save those comments for a later time because there may well be other opportunities. My constituents have spoken very strongly and very passionately. That's just a small sampling of some of the opinions that they've expressed to me and that I know that they've expressed to the Minister of Agriculture. They say we should be making farming more sustainable. They say we should be making our food systems more secure. They say we should be building more robust local economies, and that includes more robust farming economies. And they say they want this government to listen to the people of British Columbia. Have the debate, listen to the people, not rush ahead with such sweeping changes as this. I want to conclude by talking about this urban-rural divide that members opposite have done their best to foment, to create around this issue. And I want to say to that the Agricultural Land Reserve was never about, nor should it have been about, one part of the province. The Agricultural Land Reserve has never been about regional interests. The Agricultural Land Reserve and the mandate of the Agricultural Land Commission has been about protecting British Columbia's farmland for present and future generations. It's about food security for all of British Columbia. And of course, land differs in different parts of the province. And agricultural land in one part of the province can yield different crops than in other parts of the province. And some agricultural land has, obviously because of the climate, shorter and longer growing periods. It is indeed a vast province. But that does not mean that our farms in all the presently protected regions, presently protected regions should not be supported. On the contrary, we should be having a debate about how we can properly support farmers in those areas where they are most vulnerable, not talking about taking land out of the Agricultural Land Reserve. The Agricultural Land Reserve was put in place for the benefit of all British Columbians. Food affects everyone. And when the BC NDP government in the 1970s brought in the Agricultural Land Reserve, which I repeat, has not been changed by successive governments of different political stripes over 40 years. When the ALR was first brought in the 1970s, the Dave Barrett government chose to protect 5% of the land in BC in order to ensure that food production currently and for future generations. It wasn't 50%, Madam Speaker, it wasn't 10%, it was 5%. That's a tiny fraction of all the land in British Columbia. The Agricultural Land Commission is about serving British Columbians, protecting farmland for British Columbia. It needs to be controlled provincially so that the best interests of British Columbia as a whole are protected. That's what we're here to do in this House, is look out for the interests of the province as a whole. And I want to urge the members opposite, I want to urge the Minister of Agriculture to stand his ground and to go out there and do the kind of consultation that people across British Columbia are asking for, because this government does not have a mandate to proceed in this way.